All right, good afternoon. My name is Jasmine Lawrence. It's really good to be here. Thank you guys so much for being here and your encouragement in doing so for us. So a little bit about me first, and then I'll get into the paper. So I have been working on an MDiv. I was doing that for 6 years. I got 2/3 of the way through, and I was at a complementarian seminary, and I had health issues that were worsening at the time. So I explained a little bit of that connection in a recent mutuality blog post called The Perfect Storm, if it gives any indication of what was happening. But I've switched over to an MA in theology. So at my current pace, it'll take another 3 years to finish a degree. And after that, I am not totally clear on what I'm going to do other than knowing that I would love to do a PhD. I would love to pastor as well, but I've got these health issues I need to get dealt with. So I've been saying my career goal is get healthy right now. So I am on a second career after military service, if that gives any background, just as you see the way I present or my background as well coming into how I study. This paper that I wrote, it was in my Old Testament class, and I wrote it a few years ago, so I've had some time to just reflect on it for a while. And I was interested in these 5 women that I'm about to talk about because I grew up as one of 5 girls. And so the story had caught my eye, even as a girl growing up. My mom was pushing me, encouraging me, very wise, to read through the whole Bible. And so these 5 girls, I was like, oh, it's kind of like us. So at the time of my writing, my opinion about women in the church was actually changing, which was an incredibly uncomfortable place to be when I was going to a complementarian church in a complementarian seminary and denomination. So this paper comes out of a bit of that experience as well, starting to push back, and I was looking at the Old Testament going, you know, these obscure passages about women, they must have some encouragement for me personally, and I want to know what. And here I was being given really good tools in seminary to learn about that. So what I discovered, the passage that I am about to look at with you guys, Numbers 27 verses 1 to 11, I came across such a massive, fascinating information that just broke the doors wide open for far deeper study, far better reasoning than what I had time for or the skill for. But what I got to do with this paper was basically like scratch the surface at ramming speed. So we're not going to have time for questions, but I'd love to connect afterwards, maybe even just give my email address to you after or over the next couple days if you want to chat more. So let us scratch the surface at ramming speed together. I'm going to be presenting the paper but not reading strictly from it, so when it comes out in the journal, you'll probably notice a few details that have changed. So Numbers 27 verses 1 to 11 tells the story of the 5 daughters of Zelophehad. Historically, the passage has been used as a proof text to address women and their right to inherit property or leadership roles. A book called Blood Royal, Dynastic Politics in Medieval Europe highlights how Augustine insisted in his book, City of God, that women could inherit land or other property, and Catholic theologians then further applied that to the case of the Daughters of Zelophehad, and they took that and what Augustine had said and said, well, women can inherit private property but not public, so they can't have this public inheritance that involves leadership. So modern feminists decry the apparently patriarchal ideals of this passage that we're about to look at. And it's Numbers 36 follow-up, where God agrees on limitations on who the daughters of Zelophehad can marry. But it's very interesting, they still have a choice in who they can marry even then. So an article on gospelcoalition.org really got me thinking about this passage more, because what they said was that the daughters of Zelophehad are bold women with the same dominion mandate as men, which is very interesting, but nevertheless fulfill the role differently by having a gentle and quiet spirit as submissive learners and followers to men. And so that put in clear context for me what this passage is still being taken for today. So fear not, patriarchal ideals is not where this passage is going to take us. But where does it take us? What does it offer the body of Christ, the church? So to do that, I'm going to explore the passage's literary context first, and then I'll look at the narrative itself in more depth, and then I'll examine its implications for the church as a whole. So literary context. Some scholars view the Book of Numbers as an undiscerning mix of genres and sources. It's been accused of ostensible disorganization and structural confusion. However, I discovered other scholars who were making the compelling case for purposeful order in Numbers. Its narrative is Israel emerging from the sacred time and space of receiving the law at Sinai. So Israel is poising to proceed to and take ownership of the land that God has promised to them. The initial chapters of Numbers records the first census of those who are positioned to inherit. But in reality, these people have terrible attitudes about God, about Moses, and about inheriting Canaan. So they're not really ready to inherit. And the generation that has been positioned to inherit is now to be judged and wiped out. It's very intense. In Numbers chapter 25, so this is 35 years after that first census, Phinehas, the high priest's son, executes the last judgment by putting a spear through an Israelite and his Moabite prostitute. And then that's followed by the second census in chapter 26. Israel's new era thereafter is characterized first with the Daughters of Zelophehad in Numbers 27. And sin and judgment take a back seat to everything that follows. Chapter 27 becomes a marker of a positive turning point in all of Israel's attitude as an entire nation. Zelophehad's daughters are identified in the usually males-only census in chapter 26 by individual name: Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. They may be very young, even girls, seeing as they're not married, but I'll refer to them as women or daughters throughout. They're listed as the seventh generation from Joseph through Manasseh. The other tribes in the census list only 2 to 4 generations, except for Levi, which lists 5. And we're expecting about roughly 500 years from Joseph down to where these daughters are living, which means that really more than 7 generations have lived. So the author-editor has chosen purposefully to name and therefore honor 7 of their ancestors, and therefore the daughters as well. And these women are being set up already in the census for that honor. Levi's tribe lists 5 honored ancestors, and which is meaningful because Phinehas, a Levite, had just heroically starred in chapter 26. So the Daughters of Zelophehad become associated with Phinehas through narrative proximity and lengthier honored heritage. The daughters contrast Phinehas' violent, God-affirmed activity, though, because their activity is non-violent and God-affirmed. Phinehas had opposed the God-displeasing daughters of Moab, mentioned in Numbers 25, and the Daughters of Zelophehad thus become a narrative foil to those dishonorable daughters of Moab. The Daughters of Zelophehad are not only a foil to other women characters, though, but to every party that had previously challenged Moses throughout the book of Numbers. They're just the first to not be judged for doing so. So in the first half of Numbers 27, the Daughters of Zelophehad appeal a blind spot in the census inheritance assignments that would leave them entirely unprovisioned. The second half of Numbers 27 tells of Joshua being commissioned to shepherd the generation that will inherit Canaan. And he's meaningful because he's a fellow descendant of Joseph, except through Ephraim. So altogether, you have these characters in Numbers 25 to 27. Phinehas, the Daughters of Zelophehad, and Joshua, who altogether seem to be proving or catalyzing national readiness to inherit God's promises. They both represent and lead this entire generation in readiness. So let's talk more about the narrative. We'll go through from the beginning to the end of verses 1 to 11. I'm not going to read the verses, we'll just look at what I found about them. So all of the daughters' names are individually re-recorded beyond the census. So let's do what Scripture does and honor their names again by simply speaking them. Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. The Hebrew term for daughters, banot, is used 3 more times in the passage, which could be in resonance with Jacob's blessing over their ancestor Joseph. So in the Genesis 49:22 blessing that Jacob speaks over, he's speaking over all his sons, but over Joseph specifically, it's often translated idiomatically into English. And this is what the NRSV says. Joseph is a fruitful bough by a spring. His branches run over the wall. But literally in Hebrew, Joseph, a fruitful son upon a fountain, the daughters mounting over a wall. It seems that the daughters of Zelophehad, who are by extension daughters of Joseph, literally fulfill Jacob's word by leaping over a wall. So let's look at how they leap over that wall. Numbers 27 starts off with the daughters standing before all the levels of government. So you have Moses, Eleazar, the priest, who is Phinehas's father, the tribal chiefs, and the congregation at large. This dramatic gathering takes place at the entrance to the tabernacle, the place of meeting with Yahweh. In Dennis Olson's commentary on Numbers, he calls it the place of ongoing dialogue between God and God's people. These 5 women contrast Korah, a Levite who had challenged Moses in Numbers 16. So Korah arose with 4 other named Reubenite men, so 5 men altogether, and they're individually named, but they had 250 supporters behind them. Number 16 calls their supporters well-known sons of Israel. So this is a major contrast because these daughters arise with no named sympathizers. The daughters frame their request in the context of justice for their father. They clear his reputation by clarifying he did not participate in Korah's rebellion. That's very important to them. They appeal that their father shouldn't be made to suffer the fate of losing the right to inheritance with the rest of his generation just because he has only daughters. These 5 women invoke the name of Yahweh, not to be taken in vain as per the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments. And furthermore, they're actually seeking to honor their father as per the Decalogue, rather than honoring themselves. So how they interpret and act on God's law reveals something about their character. They propose, give to us. So the result of their father being honored is their own survival, and his honor and their survival are inextricably tied together. It's very important to realize what they're doing for their own survival, but it's in the context of their father's honor. They're demonstrating courage to take ownership of their own survival in the absence of male protector providers without asking for husbands, which is quite a big deal. Where the men of Israel are culturally positioned to inherit passively and by default, these women step up and actively offer to take ownership of and responsibility for the work that God has set before all of his people to take the promised land. Doing so means their own survival. Moses doesn't say anything, but he goes straight to God for that ongoing dialogue. God effectively resurrects Zelophehad from namelessness in the underworld by speaking his name. He says the daughters are right, and he instructs Moses to give to the daughters exactly as they had asked. Inheritance for daughters was actually not new in the ancient Near East. It's legislated even in Hammurabi's code. Israel likely encountered the precedent in other cultures. So what's interesting is that the daughters are potentially proposing secular culture's sense of justice, which turns out to reflect Yahweh's own character. God instructs Moses to teach his sons, the sons of Israel, this expanded view of justice, transferring responsibility for this communal justice to future generations so that no Israelite, living or dead, lose their place in Yahweh's promised inheritance by having only daughters, or from their perspective, lacking male inheritors, or from a woman's perspective, lacking male protector providers. God's instruction doesn't eradicate patriarchy, which can bother feminists, but readers must acknowledge the role in this judgment. It was to strengthen social order, which contrasts the prior image of the people running wild with the account of the golden calf. It becomes apparent that no once and for all solution in a law legislated can adequately strengthen social order, but ongoing dialogue with God is what strengthens social order. And God calls what he has just ordained mishpat, justice. The word is actually repeated a few verses later, where Eleazar is to continue inquiring before God on Joshua's behalf for mishpat, justice. The mishpat these 5 women receive is a paradigm of the responsibility of the spiritual and political leaders to remain in active dialogue with God about future issues of mishpat. The community can expect God's answers to correct culture and accommodate humanly attainable but constantly improved forms of mishpat. The Daughters' proposal has unintentional but extraordinarily lasting influence on their community, the entire community, in exposing the positive results of ongoing dialogue with God, which is no small feat given that they have so little positional power. So overall, this narrative is strategically positioned as it follows and precedes accounts of Israel's civil and religious leadership. So with that, let's look at the implications for the church. And again, we're just scratching the surface. So these daughters had a vision for something beyond what thus far revealed law gave them. They had a vision for far greater justice. God called their vision right and reshaped culture with that additional legislation. Valdemar Jansen, in his book Old Testament Ethics, A Paradigmatic Approach, points out that God's laws were not to regulate external behavior, but to form human character into God's own likeness. In taking initiative to propose action that God endorsed, demonstrated these women had godly character that was paradigmatic for all of Israel. They set a precedent for other vulnerable people to actively seek not just provision, but meaningful participation in God's kingdom. They set a model of peaceable proposals among God's people, an invitation for ongoing dialogue with God and with each other. In Jeremiah 3:19, God laments over Israel's broken covenant. God says, I longed to set you, Israel, plural feminine, among my children, literally sons, and give you, plural feminine, a pleasant land as a heritage, Hebrew nahala. God had said to Moses, let the daughters of Zelophehad possess an inheritance, nahala, among their father's brothers. So putting their story in dialogue with God's lament in Jeremiah, a possible reading emerges that God likens all of his people to culturally and legally disadvantaged daughters for whom he longs to transcend the cultural norms of God's own people to make daughters equal inheritors of all things alongside sons. So to simply look at this pericope as a legal model for inheritance, as has been historically done, is contrary to the sense of Moses' law as Torah, guiding instruction. Gordon Wenham points out that the law was given in order to persuade, and Torah was not intended to create slaves to unyielding law severed from ongoing dialogue with the community of believers and with God. The ongoing dialogue is what was needed to subvert injustice enacted in the name of that law. This leads to a much bigger conversation than we have time for here with respect to women in the church inheriting office as leaders with influence and authority. But we need to forge on past that. Jesus' code of ethics contrasts rigid application of law with God's character of grace and truth. The religious leaders of his day deemed Jesus' gracious application of Old Testament law as dangerous. He sought honor for his Father's name and reputation in ongoing dialogue with the people and with God. He publicly exposed the religious leaders' unjust, rigid application of law that sucked the life out of the people. And then God vindicated Jesus as right, raised him from the dead, and gave him the name above all names. That is, the name that will be remembered forever and receive all the inheritance. So we have a whole bunch of parallels between Christ and the daughters of Zelophehad, which means the daughters actually typify Christ for the church. Women with vision for the church must often leap over the wall, as Jacob's blessing had talked about, in order to do what they do in the church. Just like Mala, Noah, Hogla, Milcah, and Tirzah. Women must now overcome social conditioning, resist the legal structures of their day, and act contrary to the fear of being denied justice. These 5 women, the daughters of Zelophehad, acted with what power they did possess in having bodies to meaningfully occupy space, voices to be meaningfully heard, and ideas to meaningfully influence the entire community. So many women in the church are asking, let us honor our Father God's name by inheriting responsibility in the church alongside men, which becomes an opportunity for the women to thrive. The daughters' bold request challenges the limits of the church that the church places on the stewardship of God's kingdom and demands ongoing dialogue with the church and with God. Thank you.